get people to. All right. All right. Oh, I still have it on my Windows. I'm trying to like. I'm still learning, you guys. Have to be patient. Okay, so um, the reason that I picked this reading to start with is, for one thing, I don't think I've read it, and for another thing, recently there was a whole hubbub about uh, critical race theory, and looking at that, and nobody knows what it is basically the issue with it. It's based on something called critical theory, which is based on this whole habit that philosophers had of critiquing things. So critical theory comes from critiques, which means basically criticizing, uh, I suppose. So this was the first paper that came about for that really everyone based their own criticism upon. And I think arguably it could be the foundation for the way we teach critical thinking as an evaluative process. So uh, this could be considered like the very beginning of it all. Is kind of why I chose it. And it's quite dense. There's quite a lot to it, but hopefully we can have a fun time. Actually, the translators wrote a huge introduction to it. Oh yeah, it's page 96. I want to say. So once again, thank you if you're sticking around. Um, Hi there, my name is Wow Alex. I'm going to be reading The Critique of Pure Reason by Immanuel Kant. It was, I believe, written in 1787, and I will be mostly reading, but I may stop to summarize or coach through the meanings of paragraphs as I see fit. So hopefully, this will be a multi part series, but for this part, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to also skip. There were a few forwards written by Kant. All right. Human reason has the peculiar fate in one species of its cognitions that it is burdened with questions which it cannot dismiss, since they are given to it as problems by the nature of reason itself, but which it also cannot answer, since they transcend every capacity of human reason. Reason falls into this perplexity through no fault of its own. It begins from principles whose use is unavoidable in the course of experience and at the same time sufficiently warranted by it. With these principles, it rises, as its nature also requires, ever higher, to more remote conditions. But since it becomes aware in this way that its business must always remain incomplete, because the questions never cease, reason sees itself necessitated to take refuge in principles that overstep all possible use in experience, and yet seem so unsuspicious that even ordinary common sense agrees with them. But it thereby falls into obscurity and contradictions, from which it can indeed surmise that it must somewhere be proceeding on the ground of hidden errors. But it cannot discover them, for the principles on which it is proceeding, since they surpass the bounds of all experience, no longer recognize any touchstone of experience. No longer recognize any touchstone of experience. The battlefield of these endless controversies is called metaphysics. So here, Kant is claiming that reason will seek to ask questions that are more and more metaphysical or more and more abstract, but it is always grounded in experience, so is very much incapable of understanding those things. Uh, there was a time when metaphysics was called the queen of all the sciences, and if the will be taken for the deed, it deserved this title of honor on account of the preeminent importance of its object. Now, in accordance with the fashion of the age, the queen proves despised on all sides, and the matron, outcast and forsaken, mourns like Hecuba. Modo maxima verum tot generis natisque potens, nunc trabor exul inops. Ovid, Metamorphoses. In the beginning, under the administration of the dogmatists, her rule was despotic. Yet because her legislation still retained traces of ancient barbarism, this rule gradually degenerated through internal wars into complete anarchy. And the skeptics, a kind of nomads who abhor all permanent cultivation of the soil, shattered civil unity from time to time. But since there were fortunately only a few of them, they could not prevent the dogmatists from continually attempting to rebuild, though never according to a plan unanimously accepted among themselves. Once in recent times, it even seemed as though an end would be put to all these controversies, and the lawfulness of all the competing claims would be completely decided, through a certain physiology of the human understanding, by the famous Locke. But it turned out that although the birth of the purported queen was traced to the rabble of common experience, and her pretensions would therefore have been rightly rendered suspicious, nevertheless, she still asserted her claims, because in fact this genealogy was attributed to her falsely. Thus, metaphysics fell back into the same old worm-eaten dogmatism, and thus into the same position of contempt out of which the science was to have been extricated. Now, after all paths, as we persuade ourselves, have been tried in vain, what rules is tedium and complete indifferentism, the mother of chaos and night in the sciences, but at the same time also the origin, or at least the prelude, of their incipient transformation and enlightenment, when through ill-applied effort they have become obscure, confused, and useless. So in this case, Kant made an analogy calling metaphysics a queen, supported by dogmatists, and also supported uh, by experience, which was a rabble, like a common folk. And because the queen had lineage to the common folk, she was then considered sus. For it is pointless to affect indifference with respect to such inquiries, for whose object human nature cannot be indifferent. Moreover, however much they may think to make themselves unrecognizable by exchanging the language of the schools for popular style, these so-called indifferentists, the extent that they think anything at all, always unavoidably fall back into metaphysical assertions, which they yet professed so much to despise. Nevertheless, this indifference, occurring amid the flourishing of all sciences, and directed precisely at those sciences whose results, if such are to be had at all, we could at least do without, is a phenomenon deserving of our attention and reflection. This is evidently the effect not of the thoughtlessness of our age, but of its ripened power of judgment, which will no longer be put off with illusory knowledge, and which demands that reason should take on anew the most difficult of all its tasks, namely that of self-knowledge, and to institute a court of justice, by which reason may secure its rightful claims while dismissing all its groundless pretensions, and this not by mere decrees, but according to its own eternal and unchangeable laws. And this court is none other than the critique of pure reason itself. So Kant claims that indifference is not useful because, although it despises metaphysical claims, you must use a metaphysical claim to be indifferent. I'm not sure I agree with that, but he claims that that's a reason that indifference is not uh, the right way to understand things, and that the critique of pure reason itself is. Yet by this, I do not understand a critique of books and systems, but a critique of the faculty of reason in general, in respect of all the cognitions after which reason might strive independently of all experience. And hence, the decision about the possibility or impossibility of a metaphysics in general, and the determination of its sources, as well as its extent and boundaries, all, however, from principles. It is on this path, the only one left, that I have set forth, and I flatter myself that in following it, I have succeeded in removing all those errors that have so far put reason into dissension with itself in its non-experiential use. I have not avoided reason's questions by pleading the incapacity of human reason as an excuse. Rather, I have completely specified these questions according to principles, and after discovering the point where reason has misunderstood itself, I have resolved them to reason's full satisfaction. To be sure, the answer to these questions has not turned out just as dogmatically enthusiastic lust for knowledge might have expected. The latter could not be satisfied except through magical powers in which I am not an expert. Yet this was also not the intent of our reason's natural vocation, and the duty of philosophy was to abolish the semblance arising from misinterpretation, even if many prized and beloved delusions have to be destroyed in the process. In this business, I have made comprehensiveness my chief aim in view, and I make bold to say that there cannot be a single metaphysical problem that has not been solved here, or at least to the solution of which the key has not been provided. In fact, pure reason is such a perfect unity that if its principle were insufficient for even a single one of the questions that are set for it by its own nature, then this principle might as well be discarded, because then it also would not be up to answering any of the other questions with complete reliability. So Kant is claiming that his critique has answered all of his metaphysical dilemmas. While I am saying this, I believe I perceive in the face of the reader indignation mixed with contempt at claims that are apparently so pretentious and immodest. Yes. And yet they are incomparably more moderate than those of any author of the communist program who pretends to prove the simple nature of the soul or the necessity of a first beginning of the world. For such an author pledges himself to extend human cognition beyond all bounds of possible experience, of which I humbly admit that this wholly surpasses my capacity. Instead, I have to do merely with reason itself and its pure thinking to gain exhaustive acquaintance with them. I need not seek far beyond myself, because it is in myself that I encounter them, and common logic already also gives me an example of how the simple acts of reason may be fully and systematically enumerated. Only here the question is raised how much I may hope to settle with these simple acts if all the material and assistance of experience are taken away from me. So much for the completeness in reaching each of the ends, and for the comprehensiveness in reaching all of them together, which ends are not proposed arbitrarily, but are set up for us by the nature of cognition itself as the matter of our critical investigation. Furthermore, certainty and clarity, two things that concern the form of the investigation, are to be viewed as essential demands, which may rightly be made on the author who ventures upon so slippery an undertaking. So Kant claims that he is critiquing only reason itself and not the world around him or outside of him, whereas someone who would claim that a soul exists or could explain the beginning of the world would be reaching outside themselves and would also not be able to explain that. As far as certainty is concerned, I have myself pronounced the judgment that in this kind of inquiry it is in no way allowed to hold opinions, and that anything that even looks like a hypothesis is a forbidden commodity, which should not be put up for sale even at the lowest price, but must be confiscated as soon as it is discovered. For every cognition that is supposed to be a certain a priori proclaims that it wants to be held for absolutely necessary, and even more is this true of a determination of all pure cognitions a priori, which is to be the standard and thus even the example of all apodictic philosophical certainty. Whether I have performed what I have just pledged in that respect remains wholly to the judgment of the reader, since it is appropriate for an author only to present the grounds, but not to judge about their effect on his judges. But in order that he should not inadvertently be the cause of weakening his own arguments, the author may be permitted to note himself those places that, even though they pertain only to the incidental end of the work, may be the occasion for some mistrust, in order that he may in a timely manner counteract the influence that even the reader's slightest reservation on this point may have on his judgment over the chief end. I am acquainted with no investigations more important for getting to the bottom of that faculty we call the understanding, and at the same time for the determination of the rules and boundaries of its use, than those I have undertaken in the second chapter of the Transcendental Analytic under the title Deduction of the Pure Concepts of the Understanding. They are also the investigations that have cost me the most, but I hope not unrewarded, effort. This inquiry, which goes rather deep, has two sides. One side refers to the objects of the pure understanding and is supposed to demonstrate and make comprehensible the objective validity of its concepts a priori. Thus, it belongs essentially to my ends. The other side deals with the pure understanding itself, concerning its possibility and the powers of cognition on which it itself rests. Thus, it considers it in a subjective relation. And although this exposition is of great importance in respect of my chief end, it does not belong essentially to it, because the chief question always remains, what and how much can understanding and reason cognize free of all experience? And not, how is the faculty of thinking itself possible? Since the latter question is something like the search for the cause of a given effect, and is therefore something like a hypothesis, although, as I will elsewhere take the opportunity to show, this is not in fact how matters stand, it appears as if I am taking the liberty, in this case, of expressing an opinion, and that the reader might therefore be free to hold another opinion. In view of this, I must remind the reader in advance that even in case my subjective deduction does not produce the complete conviction that I expect, the objective deduction is that my primary concern would come into its full strength, on which what is said at pages A92 to 93 should even be sufficient by itself. So, Kant has just said that his primary question is what and how much can understanding and reason cognize free of all experience? What can understanding and reason do without experience of the world? But he also addresses the question of how is thinking possible, and he's begging the reader, dare I say, begging the reader to accept his explanation of how the faculty of thinking is possible. Uh, it seems like he's asking us to accept that when he goes into it. Finally, as regards clarity, the reader has a right to demand first discursive, logical clarity through concepts, but then also intuitive or aesthetic clarity through intuitions, that is, through examples or other illustrations in concreto. I have taken sufficient care for the former. That was essential to my undertaking, but was also the contingent cause of the fact that I could not satisfy the second demand, which is less strict but still fair. In the progress of my labor, I have been almost constantly undecided how to deal with this matter. Examples and illustrations always appeared necessary to me, and hence actually appeared in their proper place in my first draft. But then I looked at the size of my task and the many objects with which I would have to do, and I became aware that this alone, treated in a dry, merely scholastic manner, would suffice to fill an extensive work. Thus, I found it inadvisable to swell it further with examples and illustrations, which are necessary only for a popular aim, especially since this work could never be made suitable for popular use, and real experts in this science do not have so much need for things to be made easy for them, although this would always be agreeable. Here it could also have brought with it something counterproductive. The Abbé Terrasson says that if the size of a book is measured not by the number of pages, but by the time needed to understand it, then it can be said of many a book that it would be much shorter if it were not so short. But on the other hand, if we direct our view towards the intelligibility of a whole of speculative cognition that is wide-ranging and yet is connected in principle, we could with equal right say that many a book would have been much clearer if it had not been made quite so clear. For the aids to clarity help in the parts but often confuse in the whole, since the reader cannot quickly enough attain a survey of the whole, and all their bright colors paint over and make unrecognizable the articulation or structure of the system, which yet matters most when it comes to judging its unity and soundness. Okay, so Kant couldn't come up with any good examples to explain his work. Is my interpretation. But he says, one, I shouldn't make it easier for the rabble because we're all rabble and we're not going to understand it, or we should work harder. And then he's also saying that it's possible that he's comparing examples to paint that would paint over the structure of the system, which would be like a building. So as to whether you buy that, that's up to you, I think. It can, as it seems to me, be no small inducement for the reader to unite his effort with that of the author, when he has the prospect of carrying out, according to the outline given above, a great and important piece of work, and that in a complete and lasting way. Now, metaphysics, according to the concepts we will give of it here, is the only one of all the sciences that may promise that little but unified effort, and that indeed in a short time will complete it in such a way that nothing remains to posterity except to adapt it in a didactic manner to its intentions, yet without being able to add to its content in the least. For it is nothing but the inventory of all we possess through pure reason, ordered systematically. Nothing here can escape us, because what reason brings forth entirely out of itself cannot be hidden, but is brought to light by reason itself as soon as reason's common principle has been discovered. The perfect unity of this kind of cognition, and the fact that it arises solely out of pure concepts without any influence that would extend or increase it from experience, or even particular intuition, which would lead to a determinate experience, make this unconditioned completeness not only feasible but also necessary. Tecum habita et noris quam sit tibi crita suppellex. Perseus. Such a system of pure speculative reason I hope myself to deliver under the title Metaphysics of Nature, which will be not half so extensive, but will be incomparably richer in content than this critique, which had first to display the sources and conditions of its possibility, and needed to clear and level a ground that was completely overgrown. Here I expect from my reader the patience and impartiality of a judge, but there I will expect the cooperative experience I will expect the cooperative spirit and assistance of a fellow worker. For however completely the principles of the system may be expounded in the critique, the comprehensiveness of the system itself requires also that no derivative concepts should be lacking, which, however, cannot be estimated a priori in one leap, but must be gradually sought out. Likewise, just as in the former the whole synthesis of concepts has been exhausted, so in the latter it would be additionally demanded that the same thing should take place in respect of their analysis, which would be easy and more entertainment than labor. I have only a few more things to remark with respect to the book's printing. Since the beginning of the printing was somewhat delayed, I am able to see only about half the proof sheet, okay, in which I have come upon a few printing errors, though none that confuse the sense except the one occurring at page A379, fourth line from the bottom, where specific should be read in place of skeptical. The antinomy of pure reason, arranged in the manner of a table so that everything belonging to the thesis always continues on the left side, and what belongs to the antithesis on the right side, which I did in order to make it easier to compare proposition and counterproposition with one another. Right, so there's his preface. Hey, that's quite a preface. God bless you all. Well, thank you. I just got to your comment. Leaving your windows open. You're saints, all of you. All of you. Ooh. I'm not gonna read the second edition preface. I think that's enough. Seems quite confident, though. Quite confident that he has written quite a book. Alright. Introduction. The idea of transcendental philosophy. Experience is without doubt the first product that our understanding brings forth as it works on the raw material of sensible sensations. It is for this very reason the first teaching, and in its progress it is so inexhaustible in new instruction that the chain of life in all future generations will never have any lack of new information that can be gathered on this terrain. Nevertheless, it is far from the only field to which our understanding can be restricted. It tells us, to be sure, what is, but never that it must necessarily be thus and not otherwise. For that very reason, it gives us no true universality. And reason, which is so desirous of this kind of cognitions, is more stimulated than satisfied by it. Now, such universal cognitions, which at the same time have the character of inner necessity, must be clear and certain for themselves, independently of experience, Hence, one calls them a priori cognitions, whereas that which is merely borrowed from experience is, as it is put, cognized by only a posteriori or empirically. And notes by the translator. Now, what is especially remarkable is that even among our experiences, cognitions are mixed in that must have their origin a priori, and that perhaps serve only to establish connection among our representations of the senses. For if one removes from our experiences everything that belongs to the senses, there still remain certain original concepts and the judgments generated from them, which must have arisen entirely a priori, independently of experience, because they make one able to say more about the objects that appear to the senses than mere experience would teach, or at least make one believe that one can say this, and make assertions contain true universality and strict necessity, the likes of which merely empirical cognition can never afford. But what says still more is this, that certain cognitions even abandon the field of all possible experiences, and seem to expand the domain of our judgments beyond all bounds of experience, through concepts to which no corresponding object at all can be given to experience. And precisely in these latter cognitions, which go beyond the world of the senses, where experience can give neither guidance nor correction, lie the investigations of our reason that we hold to be far more preeminent in their importance and sublime in their final aim than everything that the understanding can learn in the field of experiences, and on which we would rather venture everything, even at the risk of erring, than give up such important investigations because of any sort of reservation or from contempt and indifference. Now, it may seem natural that as soon as one has abandoned the terrain of experience, one would not immediately erect an edifice with cognitions that one possesses without knowing whence, and on the credit of principles whose origin one does not know, without having first assured oneself of its foundation through careful investigations. Thus, that one would have long since raised the question of how the understanding could come to all these cognitions a priori, and what domain, validity, and value that they might have. And in fact, nothing is more natural if one understands by this word that which properly and reasonably ought to happen. But if one understands by it that which usually happens, then conversely, nothing is more natural and comprehensible than that this investigation should long have been neglected. For one part of these cognitions, the mathematical, has long been reliable, and thereby gives rise to a favorable expectation about others as well, although these may be of an entirely different nature. Furthermore, if one is beyond the circle of experience, then one is sure not to be contradicted through experience. The charm in expanding one's cognitions is so great that one can be stopped in one's progress only by bumping into a clear contradiction. This, however, one can avoid if one makes his inventions carefully, even though they are not thereby inventions any the less. Mathematics gives us a splendid example of how far we can go with a priori cognition, independently of experience. Now, it is occupied, to be sure, with objects and cognitions only so far as these can be exhibited in intuition. This circumstance, however, is easily overlooked, since the intuition in question can itself be given a priori, and thus can hardly be distinguished from a mere pure concept. Encouraged by such a proof of the power of reason, the drive for expansion sees no bounds. The light dove in free flight cutting through the air, the resistance of which it feels, could get the idea that it could do even better in airless space. Likewise, Plato abandoned the world of the senses because it posed so many hindrances for the understanding, and dared to go beyond it on the wings of the ideas, in the empty space of pure understanding. He did not notice that he made no headway by his efforts, for he had no resistance, no support, as it were, by which he could stiffen himself, and to which he could apply his powers in order to get his understanding off the ground. It is, however, a customary fate of human reason in speculation to finish its edifice as early as possible, and only then to investigate whether the ground has been adequately prepared for it. But at that point, all sorts of excuses will be sought to assure us of its sturdiness or to refuse such a late and dangerous examination. What keeps us free of all worry and suspicion during the construction, however, and flatters us with apparent thoroughness, is this. A great part, perhaps the greatest part of the business of our reason, consists in analyses of the concepts that we already have of objects. This affords us a multitude of cognitions that, though they are nothing more than illuminations or clarifications of that which is already thought in our concepts, though still in a confused way, are, at least as far as their form is concerned, treasured as if they were new insights, though they do not extend the concepts that we have in either matter or content, but only set them apart from each other. Now, since this procedure does yield a real a priori cognition, which makes secure and useful progress, reason, without itself noticing it under these pretenses, surreptitiously makes assertions of quite another sort, in which it adds something entirely alien to given concepts a priori, without one knowing how it was able to do this, and without this question even being allowed to come to mind. I will therefore deal with the distinction between these two kinds of cognition right at the outset. Uh, so I'll take the liberty to summarize a little bit. Uh, it seems like Kant is saying, and uses mathematics as an example, of being able to build entire knowledges and understandings that are completely based not on experience and that can only build on themselves. Then he compared Plato to a dove, which was made me laugh. And then he claimed that we will often, in creating these kinds of a priori knowledges or trying to construct something that is not based on experience, we will use our preconceptions of actual objects that we have experienced in order to make these a priori assumptions. He also introduced a problem of uh, being able to determine the difference between something that is a foundational pillar or an assumption that you just take for granted versus something that is built off of something else, and being able to distinguish between those two things. On the difference between analytic and synthetic judgments. In all judgments in which the relation of a subject to the predicate is thought, if I consider only affirmative judgments, since the application to negative ones is easy, the relation is possible in two different ways. Either the predicate B belongs to the subject A as something that is covertly contained in this concept A, or B lies entirely outside the concept A, though to be sure it stands in connection with it. In the first case, I call the judgment analytic. In the second, synthetic. Analytic judgments, affirmative ones, are thus those in which the connection of the predicate is thought through identity, but those in which this connection is thought without identity are to be called synthetic judgments. One could also call the former judgments of clarification and the latter judgments of amplification, since through the predicate the former do not add anything to the concept of the subject, but only break it up by means of analysis into its component concepts, which were already thought in it, though confusedly. While the latter, on the contrary, add to the concept of the subject a predicate that was not thought in it at all, and could not have been extracted from it through any analysis. For example, if I say, all bodies are extended, then this is an analytic judgment. For I do not need to go outside the concept that I combine with the word body in order to find that extension is connected with it, but rather I need only to analyze that concept, i.e., become conscious of the manifold that I always think in it, in order to encounter this predicate therein. It is therefore an analytic judgment. On the contrary, if I say all bodies are heavy, then the predicate is something entirely different from that which I think in the mere concept of a body in general. The addition of such a predicate thus yields a synthetic judgment. Now, just to add a comment, I'm wondering if the translation of this was difficult, but when he says all bodies are extended, I'm wondering if it means that they have dimensionality. Uh, that could be what he's trying to say. So whether something's large or small, it would have some kind of dimensionality because that's built into the concept of what a body is. But being heavy versus light would maybe have, maybe not all bodies would be heavy. It would be introduced a second concept. Although, if there was a word for having a weight or a mass, then perhaps Kant would think that is an analytic judgment. Now, from this, it is clear 1. That through analytic judgments, our cognition is not amplified at all, but rather the concept which I already have is set out and made intelligible to me. 2. That in synthetic judgments, I must have, in addition to the concept of the subject, something else, X, on which the understanding depends, in cognizing a predicate that does not lie in that concept as nevertheless belonging to it. In the case of empirical judgments or judgments of experience, there is no difficulty here. For this X is the complete experience of the object that I think through some concept A, which constitutes only a part of this experience. For although I do not at all include the predicate of weight in the concept of a body in general, the concept nevertheless designates the complete experience through a part of it, to which I can therefore add still other parts of the very same experience as belonging to the former. I can first cognize the concept of body analytically through the marks of extension or impenetrability, of shape, etc., which are all thought in this concept. But now I amplify my cognition, and in looking back to the experience from which I had extracted this concept of body, I find that weight is also always connected with the previous marks. Experience is therefore the X that lies outside the concept A, and on which the possibility of the synthesis of the predicate of weight, B, with the concept A is grounded. But in synthetic a priori art judgments, this means of help is entirely lacking. If I am to go outside the concept A in order to cognize another B as combined with it, what is it on which I depend, and through which the synthesis becomes possible, since I here do not have the advantage of looking around for it in the field of experience? Take the proposition, anything that happens has its cause. In the concept of something that happens, I think, to be sure, of an existence which was preceded by a time, etc., and from that analytic judgments can be drawn. But the concept of a cause indicates something different from the concept of something that happens, and is not contained in the latter representation at all. How then do I come to say something quite different about that which happens in general, and to cognize the concept of cause as belonging to it, even though not contained in it? What is the X here on which the understanding depends, when it believes itself to discover, beyond the concept of A, a predicate that is foreign to it, and that is yet connected with it? It cannot be experience, for the principle that has been adduced adds the latter representations to the former, not only with greater generality than experience can provide, but also with the expression of necessity, hence entirely a priori and from mere concepts. Now, the entire final aim of our speculative a priori cognition rests on such synthetic, i.e., ampliative principles. The analytic ones are, to be sure, most important and necessary, only for attaining that distinctness of concepts that is requisite for a secure and extended synthesis, as a really new construction. A certain mystery thus lies hidden here, the elucidation of which alone can make progress in the boundless field of pure cognition, of the understanding, secure and reliable, namely, to uncover the ground of the possibility of synthetic a priori judgments with appropriate generality, to gain insight into the conditions that make every kind of them possible, and not merely to designate this entire cognition, which comprises its own species, in a cursory outline, but to determine it completely and adequately for every use in a system in accordance with its primary sources, divisions, domain, and boundaries. So much provisionally for the peculiarities of synthetic judgments. So Kant is saying that you have analytic judgments and synthetic judgments, and that analytic judgments are a part of the actual concept, whereas a synthetic judgment would have to introduce something else to the concept, and he is more interested in the synthetic judgments than the analytic ones, because the analytic ones just define what the concept is that you're talking about. Now, from all this, there results the idea of a special science, which could serve for the critique of pure reason. Every cognition is called pure. However, that is not mixed with anything foreign to it. But a cognition is called absolutely pure, in particular, in which no experience or sensation at all is mixed in, and that is thus fully a priori. Now, reason is the faculty that provides the principles of cognition a priori. Hence, pure reason is that which contains the principles for cognizing something absolutely a priori. An organon of pure reason would be a sum total of those principles in accordance with which all pure a priori cognitions can be acquired and actually brought about. The exhaustive application of such an organon would create a system of pure reason. But since that requires a lot, and it is still an open question whether such an amplification of our cognition is possible at all, and in what cases it would be possible, we can regard a science of the mere estimation of pure reason, of its sources and boundaries, as the propedeutic to the system of pure reason. Such a thing would not be a doctrine, but must be called only a critique of pure reason, and its utility would really be only negative, living not for the amplification, but only for the purification of our reason, for keeping it free of errors, by which a great deal is already won. I call all cognition transcendental, that is occupied not so much with objects, but rather with our a priori concepts of objects in general. A system of such concepts would be called transcendental philosophy. But this is again too much for the beginning. Yes, it is, Kant. Yes, it is. So Kant is excited about making an organon of pure reason, which would include no experience whatsoever. So it would be making statements and cognitions purely through other statements and cognitions or a priori assumptions. And those a priori assumptions could not be based on experiences. Thus, the organon of pure reason would not be a positive thing, but would be basically the ultimate gatekeeper of ideas in the organon. And I feel like organon should maybe be like a card in a card game. I call. Okay, here we are. This is too much for the beginning. For since such a science would have to contain completely both analytic as well as synthetic a priori cognition, it is, as far as our aim is concerned, too broad in scope, since we need to take the analysis only as far as is indispensably necessary in order to provide insight into the principles of a priori synthesis in their entire scope, which is our only concern. So, unfortunately, Kant cannot build his organon. This investigation, which we can properly call not doctrine, but only transcendental critique, since it does not aim at the amplification of the cognitions themselves, but only at their correction, and is to supply the touchstone of the worth or worthlessness of all cognitions a priori, is that which with which we are now concerned. Such a critique is accordingly a preparation, if possible, for an organon, and if this cannot be accomplished, then at least for a canon, in accordance with which the complete system of the philosophy of pure reason, whether it is to consist in the amplification of the mere limitation of its cognition, can in any case at least some day be exhibited both analytically and synthetically. For that this should be possible, indeed that such a system should not be too great in scope for us to hope to be able entirely to complete it, and be assessed in advance from the fact that our object is not the nature of things, which is inexhaustible, but the understanding, which judges about the nature of things, and this in turn only in regard to its a priori cognition, the supply of which, since we do not need to search for it externally, cannot remain hidden from us, and in all likelihood is small enough to be completely recorded, its worth or worthlessness assessed, and subjected to a correct appraisal. All right, so that was part one, and boy, we're in for a ride. Kant really seems to have a love for things which you cannot experience, which I find completely unrelatable, but I am now invested in his journey upon the dove's wings in the engines of his organon for creating the analytic and synthetic judgments that he needs to create at least a canon of a priori knowledge. So I hope you enjoyed listening to this and perhaps doing the dishes or playing Minecraft while you listen to it. Uh, Thank you very much for tuning in. And part two will be the division of transcendental philosophy. So I will catch you next time. This was well, Alex. Thank you. All right. That's that. Heavens to Betsy. Um, I think we've gone so far off. Because I think there was a trend of critiquing this and that of in philosophy, and not all of them were transcendental philosophy. When you get to things like critical race theory, that's actually not transcendental at all. That's very down to earth and thinking about like what is actually happening. What can we how can we evaluate what's going on in actual systems in our society? So I think it's the evaluative exercise of saying, okay, what are the positive things? What can we create? What must we put aside? Uh, and that's I think the tradition that critical theory seems to be following. I wouldn't claim to be an expert in any case, but I'm like wondering also now because like no one wants to seem like a dummy when people are like, okay, so critical race theory, and then it's like, well, but what about like critical thinking? That's taught in school. Like no one wants to be called a dummy. Like critical race theory is different from critical thinking, and actually, I think they're not different. I think the critical is there because it's the same critical is like let's make a critique, let's evaluate positives or negatives. It's the evaluative exercise. Um, so I think it would be fair. I think it would be fair to just be like, so you don't believe in critical thinking? Um, don't think that would make you sound like a dummy. I think that the word is there because it means the same thing. That's what I'm starting to think. Um, am I a big fan of transcendental philosophy? No, but we're gonna go on a journey. I am a fan of Kant now. I'm invested in his passion. So that's maybe a good thing. But I am definitely I do need channel points so people can make me drink water. I'm gonna call it a night. But I really appreciate you tuning in. I'm going to try to rate someone, even though I'm really bad at rating. I'm gonna I mean I'm not bad at it. I just have not.